In the centre of Stockport, three rivers merge to form what has become one of Britain's best-known rivers. Ancient peoples christened these waters Mersey, meaning boundary, and from early times the River Mersey formed a natural barrier between Cheshire and Lancashire. Just as the Mersey gathers to swell the Irish Sea, it turns sharply, creating a huge tidal pool that spawned one of the world's great cities, Liverpool. From a time in prehistory, the pool of the Mersey estuary supported a tiny hamlet of fishermen that was the forerunner of modern Liverpool. That early community was clustered around a bridge at the town's end, near to the site of the Picton Library, Museum and Art Gallery complex. This is the oldest part of Liverpool. Although the cluster of fishermen's huts that once stood here was well established, by the time of William the Conqueror's Doomsday Survey of 1086, it was still so insignificant it didn't even warrant a mention. Unlike nearby settlements like Walton, Childwall and West Derby, that would eventually be swallowed up by their little neighbour. For now, though, the fishermen of Liverpool carried on their business, as they had done for centuries, unaware of and untouched by the momentous changes that were taking place in England under Norman rule. Then, in 1150, a Benedictine monastery was founded on a remote headland in Wirral called Birchen Head. The monastery was granted the right to run a ferry service, and Liverpool's fishermen soon became familiar with the monks operating the early ferry across the Mersey. 800 years later, the service is still going strong. In 1207, King John finally put the name Liverpool on the map when he decided to develop it as a supply port for his forces trying to extend his Irish lands. He built a castle, long since demolished and remembered only by a street name, on a ridge overlooking the river. He also offered inducements to all who would settle in the remote fishing village on the banks of the Mersey. The village began to expand, and gradually limited trade developed between Liverpool and Ireland, beginning the strong and inextricable bond between the two. Although the name Liverpool now appeared on maps of Britain, it was to be another 5 centuries before the town achieved any degree of real importance. During this time, 2 families, the Stanleys and the Molyneux, gained prominence locally, and both left their indelible mark on the modern city. The Molyneux were constables of Liverpool Castle, while the Stanleys' stronghold was Liverpool Tower, that stood next to St Nicholas Church on the site of the modern Tower buildings. In 1424, the vying for power between the two families nearly boiled over into Liverpool's very own civil war, when a battle on Liverpool Heath between the two sets of supporters was only narrowly avoided. Later, in the same century, the Stanleys came to the forefront of national events, when in 1485 Thomas, Lord Stanley, crowned his stepson Henry VII after the Battle of Bosworth, and in return for his support was created Earl of Derby. Some of the Stanley lands around Knowsley Hall, seat of the Earls of Derby, today play host to a collection of wild animals. Part of the old Molyneux estate, including their Merseyside seat, Croxteth Hall, became a country park. It's perhaps fitting that the estates of Liverpool's medieval champions should protect the modern city from the westward spread of the Manchester conurbation. The Molyneux and Stanleys forgot their old differences when civil war broke out in England in 1642. James Stanley, Mayor of Liverpool and later 7th Earl of Derby, seized Liverpool for the king. Manchester had come down on the side of Parliament, and in September 1642, Stanley, aided by Lord Molyneux, launched an attack on Liverpool's neighbour. They failed in their attempt to take Manchester for the king, and early in 1643, parliamentarian ships from Manchester appeared in the Mersey estuary for the return leg. After 2 days of fierce fighting, the Roundheads captured Dale Street and St Nicholas Church, mounting guns on its tower and forcing Liverpool to capitulate. John Moore, from a prominent local Puritan family that lived in the old hall that gave its name to Old Hall Street, was appointed military governor of the town, a post he held until June 1644, when Lord Derby persuaded Prince Rupert, nephew of Charles I, to halt his march north and retake Liverpool for the king. Rupert looked down on the little port from the heights of Everton and observed scornfully, "It's a mere crow's nest that a parcel of boys might take." This was to prove a serious miscalculation. As the overwhelmingly superior royalist troops mustered, women and children were evacuated from Liverpool, and its hopelessly outnumbered defence force awaited their fate. The tension was broken only when the royalists unleashed their might on the little town. Incredibly, against the odds, they were beaten back once and then again, losing lives at a rate they had never expected. This forced Rupert to change his strategy, and he erected trenches along the line of modern Lime Street, drew up his artillery, and began to bombard Liverpool. After a fierce battle lasting several days, the town had still not been taken, and to make matters worse for Prince Rupert, he had used up more than 100 barrels of gunpowder that should have been used for his northern campaign. In a desperate attempt to salvage some pride, the royalists again changed their tactics. Carroll Molyneux, brother of Lord Molyneux, led a surprise night attack through fields to the north of town and managed to breach the Roundhead defences. After several hours of ferocious street fighting, Liverpool finally fell, and the royalists exacted a horrible and bloody revenge for the 1,500 men they had lost in capturing the mere crow's nest. John Moore escaped and had the last laugh. Liverpool was soon back in Roundhead hands after a 2-month blockade, and Moore was one of those who signed Charles I's death warrant. The end of civil war coincided with the start of Liverpool's rise in importance. Colonisation of North America and growing trade with the New World had shifted the focus of world trade from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic. Ports like Liverpool and Bristol, instead of sitting on the edge of world civilization, now found themselves at its heart. And although Bristol was the main player in exploiting the new opportunities, by the start of the 18th century, ships were sailing from Liverpool in increasing numbers to the West Indies for sugar and to Virginia for tobacco and cotton. By now, many of those ships were armed to protect themselves against Spanish marauders, and when England and Spain went to war in 1739, Liverpool's mariners threw themselves into the highly profitable business of privateering. Armed ships set out to plunder Spanish vessels, and with just 10% of proceeds going to the Crown, the profits from a successful voyage could be huge. Liverpudlians soon thrilled at the exploits of men like Wallasey-born Captain Fortunatus Wright. France had joined forces with Spain in 1744, and in 1746 with his ship Fame, Wright captured 16 French ships worth around £400,000. Of the many other 18th century privateers who made their fortunes, one of the luckiest has to be Peter Baker, who went on to become a mayor of Liverpool. He built and armed a ship which he named Mentor. Unfortunately, when completed, the ship looked anything but seaworthy, and at the sight of it, Baker's financial backers pulled out, leaving him facing bankruptcy. In desperation, he mustered a crew as motley as his ship, and to the jeers of onlookers, limped out of Liverpool dock in search of booty to pay off his debts. He soon came across a French ship, the Carnatic, that inexplicably gave up without a fight. Baker couldn't believe his luck when he found the Carnatic was stuffed with treasure, and just 3 weeks after he left, he sailed back to Liverpool, nearly £500,000 better off. He bought Mossley Hall on Mossley Hill, overlooking the Mersey. Local wags renamed it Carnatic Hall, and one of Liverpool's university's halls that now stands on the site retains the name that recalls Peter Baker's exploits. Yet another privateersman who made his mark on Liverpool was Tynesider William Hutchinson. Hutchinson had already made his fortune on the high seas when in 1759 he was appointed principal water bailiff and dockmaster, a post he held for nearly 40 years. Under his guidance, Liverpool would become one of the most important ports in the world. Hutchinson's first major task was to prepare Liverpool for a threatened attack by a French fleet that had virtually blockaded Liverpool Bay. He raised a force to man armed ships that would form a barrier across the Mersey. The walls of St. Nicholas Church were reinforced and mounted with guns. People evacuated their homes for the safety of Everton. French prisoners were moved from Liverpool Tower to Chester Castle. Reinforcements arrived from Manchester, and Liverpool braced itself. The attack never came. On the 28th of February 1760, a squadron of English frigates sailed into Liverpool Bay and destroyed the French fleet. The enemy commander, Captain Thureau, died. 300 of his men were killed or injured, and survivors ended up in the Tower. When they were eventually released, some of the French stayed on, met and married local girls, and some present-day Liverpudlians are descended from those French prisoners of war. During William Hutchinson's term of office, another trade that made fortunes for Liverpool's merchants became well and truly established. By 1764, 90 Liverpool ships regularly left St. George's Dock for Africa, loaded with goods to be exchanged for slaves. There, as many as 500 Africans were crammed into a space between decks, often no more than 3 feet high, and transported to the West Indies or America, where a good specimen could fetch as much as £50. Once emptied of their human cargo, the ships were crammed with rum and tobacco and sailed back to Liverpool to start their highly profitable 3-way trip all over again. Occasionally, slaves who couldn't fetch a decent price in the West Indies, usually children, found themselves for sale in Liverpool. An advert in Williamson's Liverpool Advertiser in 1765 read, "To be sold by auction at St George's Coffee House, a very fine Negro girl, about 8 years of age." The wealth created by privateering and slaving wasn't confined only to the ship owners, and it became the practice in Liverpool for men to buy shares for wives and children when work started on a new privateer or slaver. Launches were often therefore grand, well-attended affairs, with shareholders taking a trip upriver on the new ship. On one occasion, tragedy struck when the privateer Pelican capsized in the Mersey, with the loss of 70 lives. In 1773, events took place on the other side of the Atlantic that would seriously dent Liverpool's newfound prosperity. The great-grandchildren of the American colonists resented the influence still exerted on them by a British government they felt no allegiance to, and in protest they dumped shiploads of valuable cargo in Boston Harbour. 2 years after the Boston Tea Party, America declared independence and Britain declared war. This was a disaster for Liverpool, severely disrupting transatlantic trade and bringing great hardship to the town and its inhabitants. Once busy ships lay idle in the docks, and inevitably the worst to suffer were the sailors and their families. Resentment grew, and eventually boiled over in a dispute over wages for refitting the slave ship Derby. On hearing news that 9 sailors had been arrested and thrown in the Tower, a 2,000-strong mob armed themselves, freed the 9 and headed for the docks, intent on destruction. After talks, the Derby's owners agreed to meet the men's demands, but word got around that 300 unemployed men had been hired to seize the riot leaders. The newly enraged mob surrounded the Exchange building, and after a pane of glass was broken, a guard of special constables opened fire, killing 7 sailors and wounding 40. Next day, led by a man they called General Gage, the rioters, each with a red ribbon in his hat, plundered muskets and dragged cannon from ships to the main streets, surrounded the Exchange once more, and raised a red flag before opening fire from Castle Street. The riot was eventually ended by Lord Pembroke's regiment, sent from Manchester. 60 of the ringleaders were arrested, and 14 of them were sentenced to deportation to America. While at home, the hardship continued. The number of Liverpool ships sailing to Africa fell from 105 to 12, and nearly a third of the town's 35,000 population were supported by the church or charities. Ironically, Liverpool's fortunes were revived by the entry of France and Spain into the War of Independence. This brought new opportunities for privateering, and within 8 months more than 120 ships had been refitted and sailed off to plunder the Atlantic, taking with them 9,000 formerly unemployed sailors. When the American War ended in 1783, Liverpool's recovery was rapid, based largely on the slave trade, and during the next 10 years, more than 300,000 slaves were transported from Africa by Mersey ships. By 1793, Liverpool had overtaken Bristol as the country's leading port after London. The heart of Liverpool's commercial activity was in an area known as the Exchange Flags behind the town hall. Here, 18th century merchants struck deals for all manner of goods passing through Liverpool port. By now, the town's population had grown to about 60,000. Some of the newcomers were respectable merchants or skilled craftsmen, but others were far less savoury characters, as this description of a slave ship crew shows. They were the very dregs of humanity. Some had escaped from jails. Others sought to leave the country should they fall into the hands of justice. These wretches flocked to Liverpool when ships were fitted out. Another description of Liverpool and some of its new inhabitants from the son of a slave ship owner is equally vivid and scathing. Its streets were tortuous and narrow, with pavements in the middle skirted by mud. Sidewalks were rough with sharp-pointed stones that made it a misery to walk upon them. Scarcely a town by the margin of the ocean could be more salty in its people than the men of 18th century Liverpool. Imagine the scenes in and around the port when these crews came back to Liverpool after a long voyage. Sailors returning from hard months at sea had plenty of money to spend and were determined to enjoy it.
I went to stay in that country, it was my intent. But girls in strong whiskey like other damn fools, I soon was transported back to Liverpool, and it's row. Row, bullies, row, them Liverpool Judies have got us in tow. We shipped on the Alaska, lying out in the bay, awaiting for the fair wind to get on the way. The sailors all drunk and their backs is all sore, their whiskey's all
Disreputable ladies offered sailors an alternative way of getting rid of their booty, and afterwards hoped to gain extra reward by giving their client away to the press gangs that scoured the area to forcibly recruit off-duty seamen into the Royal Navy. Despite the warning cries of hawks abroad whenever the hated press gangs appeared, many a drunken sailor found himself back at sea far sooner than he'd planned. There was, however, a refuge from the attentions of the press gangs. Across the Mersey at Seacombe, on the site now occupied by this nursing home, once stood an inn known as Mother Redcap's. Sailors prepared to make the short but hazardous row across the river would find a mooring place known as Red Betts. From here they could make their way through the Red Noses tunnels and enter the inn through a trap door to enjoy days and nights of drinking, fighting and debauchery uninterrupted by press gangs. The landlady of Mother Redcap's was Poll Jones. As confidant and friend of the wild crews of privateers, smugglers and wreckers, she had their trust and often held what was left of their pay until they returned from another adventure in the Spanish Main or another delivery of slaves. Inevitably, some never returned, and it's thought that Poll Jones may have amassed a small fortune, although exploration of the Red Noses caves has not, as yet, revealed a hoard of treasure. Traditions die hard in Liverpool, and incredibly the custom of handing over pay to publicans for safekeeping continued into the 20th century, despite the provision of safes at the Sailors' Home and other places. This confidence was rarely misplaced, and pubs like the Baltic Fleet in Wapping were far more than just watering holes to Liverpool's sailors. In 1797, Liverpool's more respectable citizens unanimously agreed it was about time the town had a new coat of arms to match its newfound prosperity. A coat of arms that reflected Liverpool's history, harking back to the town's first charter granted by King John in 1207. They remembered that his symbol was a bird of some sort. But what kind of bird? This they couldn't establish, as the King's seal had been lost in the Civil War siege of 1644. It was in fact an eagle, but the council plumped for a local bird, a cormorant. The artist's ineptitude produced a creature unlike any other, but instead of sacking the artist and starting again, Liverpool, in true Liverpool fashion, adopted his mutant, and the liver bird became part of the town's folklore. The early 19th century brought a change in the law of the land that many in Liverpool thought would be ruinous for the town. In 1806, William Wilberforce's bill for the abolition of slavery was passed by Parliament, bringing an end to the trade that had made a number of Liverpudlians extremely wealthy. As it turned out, the consequences were not nearly as disastrous as had been feared. Trade with America was still expanding rapidly, and Liverpool was ideally placed to cash in on the northern-based industrial revolution that by now was well underway. Liverpool's wealth and newfound importance began to reflect in its architecture. By 1811, a new and very grand town hall was completed. The following decade, Jesse Hartley was appointed dock engineer, and the town embarked on rebuilding its quays and river wall and building the grand warehouses that are still a feature of Liverpool, although today many are showing their age. In 1821, a group of Liverpool and Manchester merchants met to discuss how the town's overland transport system might be improved. They decided to commission George Stephenson, the railway pioneer, to build a line from Manchester to Liverpool, and great excitement gripped the town on the day of the official opening of the world's first passenger railway. George Stephenson himself drove the inaugural steam locomotive, the Northumbrian, that was packed with dignitaries, including the Duke of Wellington. Among the party waiting to greet the distinguished guests aboard the Northumbrian was Liverpool MP William Huskisson. As the train approached Edge Hill, Huskisson got so excited he slipped off the platform and was run over by Stephenson's rocket coming the other way, to become the first man killed by a train. Another first for Liverpool, and a grisly welcome for the Duke of Wellington. Despite this rather unfortunate event, Liverpool's first railway proved extremely successful, and by the mid-19th century, half of all Britain's imports came through Liverpool, and the town continued to thrive. In 1838, the town's wealth, work started on what has been described as the greatest Greco-Roman building in Europe. St George's Hall was designed by Henry Lonsdale Elmes, and the splendour and sheer magnitude of the structure with its towering Gothic columns bear testament more than any words to the great wealth of Victorian Liverpool's merchant princes. Construction of the hall was paid for by subscriptions from wealthy citizens, and no doubt they were extremely proud of their new possession. There was, though, another side to mid-19th century Liverpool. Its population had been increasing steadily since Liverpool began its rise in importance, but during the first half of the 19th century it began to increase at an alarming rate, swelled by refugees from the famine in Ireland. In 1847 alone, 300,000 people crossed the Irish Sea, most with only the clothes they stood in. The lucky ones found homes in packed cellar slums, squalid courts, or the workhouse on Brownlow Hill. The rest slept rough in alleys, doorways and pavements around the already overcrowded port, producing scenes of unimaginable hardship unmatched anywhere in England. One report tells of 23,000 young children running wild in the dockland, scavenging just to stay alive. many didn't, and 1 in 2 children in Liverpool died before the age of 11. In the overcrowded courts and cellars, 2 or 3 families lived in a single room, and sanitation was non-existent. The worst area was between Scotland Road and Vauxhall Road. Here, cholera and typhoid were a constant companion of starvation. Although other large towns and cities in Britain had problems caused by the massive shift of the population from country to town, nowhere were those problems more acute than in Liverpool. In an attempt to cope with the desperate plight of the poor, in 1847, Liverpool's authorities appointed the country's first medical officer of health, and later, under the guidance of merchant and philanthropist William Rathbone, introduced the new concept of district nursing. Then, in the 1860s, the corporation pioneered a municipal housing scheme. All valiant efforts, but in reality, all they could hope to do was scratch the surface. And in 1855, the army were called in to quell hunger riots in the town's poorest areas. The town's situation was aggravated when civil war broke out in America, disrupting Liverpool's transatlantic trade. When trade suffered, the first victims were the hordes of casual dock workers who gathered each morning hoping to get taken on. No ships meant no work, and for those caught up in this hand-to-mouth way of life, the situation quickly became desperate. As well as despair, the period produced heroes like Canon Major Leicester and his friend Father James Nugent, son of an Irish immigrant and one of many priests who championed the cause of the poor. 10 of them died from contracting poor diseases and were known as the Liverpool Martyrs. When Father Nugent died in 1903, he was mourned by Catholics and Protestants alike. Against this backdrop of abject poverty, the corporation was struggling to combat. Fortunes were still being made from the town's trade, and when Liverpool became a city in 1880, its 600,000 population contained a sharp contrast between rich and poor. The workhouse on Brownlow Hill never had room to spare, while a short stroll away, the wealthy patronised the Botanic Gardens with its conservatory packed with plants brought from all corners of the world by Liverpool shipmasters. Another popular haunt for better-off Victorian Merseysiders was the racecourse at Aintree and its annual steeplechase. The event actually started down the road at Maghull in 1837 by William Lynn, a local publican. 2 years later, the race moved to its traditional home and was won by a horse called Lottery. Captain Beecher came a cropper on Conrad and gave his name to one of the most famous jumps in steeplechasing history. In 1843, the Grand Liverpool Steeplechase was nationalised and, as the Grand National, went on to become one of Britain's major sporting events. As Liverpool entered the 20th century, the sharp contrast between rich and poor was emphasised by the construction of grand public and commercial buildings just a few hundred yards from hovels, and on a scale unmatched anywhere else in Britain. One of these new buildings dominated all others and has become Liverpool's best-known landmark. The granite-faced Royal Liver Building, with its pair of liver birds tied down in case they fly away, was the first high-rise building in Britain with a concrete reinforced frame, and since its completion in 1911 has been a comforting sight for hundreds of thousands of homeward-bound sailors. The first decade of the 20th century also saw the emergence of a new era in Mersey shipping. Since the first steam ferry began to operate on the Mersey in 1826, steam had replaced sail as the favoured means of power, and in 1907 Liverpool docks were crowded with people hoping for a view of the four-funnelled Lusitania. On her maiden voyage, she crossed to New York in a record time of 4 days, 19 hours and 52 minutes, confirming a new era of luxury transatlantic travel provided by the Regal Cunard and White Star liners. Boat trains became a common sight at the riverside station. Thousands of passengers, including many distinguished VIPs, crowded the platforms to board splendid ships bound for America, Canada, South America, Australia and the Far East. Liverpool was the fashionable departure point for wealthy passengers. Liverpool's continued commercial success also meant that its population continued to expand, swelled not only by Irish and Welsh, but also now by refugees fleeing the turmoil in Eastern Europe. They came to Liverpool hoping for a passage to America, but many stayed, swelling the population of a city already bursting at the seams. By now, many better-off Merseysiders were escaping to Wirral, creating affluent societies across the water, in sharp contrast to the squalor still prevalent in many parts of Liverpool. The huge infusion of people that started a century earlier and was producing so many problems was also producing something that would become as much a feature of later 20th century Liverpool as the River Mersey itself. The Scouser. When newcomers from Ireland, Wales and later Eastern Europe were thrown into the melting pot of Liverpool's back streets, with a local people already influenced by 200 years of contact with foreign ports, what emerged was a new breed of people. Tough, sharp-witted, exuberant, with a sense of humour and a spirit that can only come from adversity, even their name stems from hardship. Lobscouse was a dish made from mutton, potatoes and onions, popular with Scandinavian sailors. Poor 19th century Liverpool housewives couldn't afford the mutton, and the potato and onion gruel called blind scouse was often the only thing between working-class Liverpudlians and starvation. The people who grew up on blind scouse, Scousers, also developed a new language. When Irish and Welsh accents got hold of the native Lancashire burr, the result was a distinct and totally unique dialect. Amongst the many other traits of the Scouser is a leaning towards the arts, and the mixing of cultures that began in the 18th century has in the 20th century produced a wealth of writers, poets, artists, actors, entertainers and musicians any city would be proud of. Of course, the new immigrants to Liverpool had no idea their grandchildren would produce the artists of the future. Their only concern was surviving, and while they were struggling to do that, a giant began to grow in their midst. In 1902, work started on the construction of Liverpool's Cathedral Church of Christ. The Anglican cathedral, built of red sandstone from Woolton, is the creation of architect Sir Giles Gilbert Scott, who was just 21 years old when he was commissioned. He died 18 years before his life's work was completed, in 1978. The cathedral cemetery was created from an old quarry that provided material for many of Liverpool's 18th century buildings. and later an illicit playground for kids from Toxteth. Today it's fenced off to protect the graves of its 60,000 occupiers, including numerous sea captains and a monument to the unfortunate MP William Huskisson. 12 years after the foundations of the cathedral were laid, Europe plunged into war, and Liverpool was horrified at news that the Lusitania had been sunk. Anti-German rioting followed, and shops with German-sounding names were looted. Despite the hostilities, World War I brought a period of relative prosperity to most people in Liverpool, with the docks full and the shipyards across the Mersey at Birkenhead always busy. The end of the war, though, was to signal the return of poverty, and the August bank holiday of 1919 brought the worst riots since the sailors took up arms in 1775. The events were sparked off by a strike for higher pay by 930 Liverpool policemen, and gathered pace when they were joined by a large number of the city's unemployed. Mobs looted shops in Scotland Road and around Lime Street Station, with the remaining on-duty police unable to contain them. The Navy and Army were called up, and HMS Valiant, with 2 destroyers, sailed into the Mersey estuary, while troops were quartered in St George's Hall and tanks assembled outside ready for action. This show of force deterred most of the rioters, and peace was restored, although the poverty that was at the root of the trouble continued through the 1920s depression, and by 1930 1 man in 4 was out of work. The situation was partly relieved when it was decided to dig a tunnel under the Mersey to provide quick and easy access from Liverpool to Wirral. Construction of the Mersey Tunnel brought many much-needed jobs. When it was opened in 1934 by King George V, it was the longest underwater thoroughfare in the world and hailed as a marvel of engineering. The year before the tunnel opened, work had started on a second cathedral for Liverpool, this one to serve the city's large Catholic community, and built, ironically, or maybe appropriately, on the site of the old Brownlow Hill workhouse that was once home to so many Irish immigrants. The outbreak of World War II slowed things down, and by 1941 only the crypt was finished. A steep rise in cost rendered the original design impossible, and the cathedral was eventually completed to a new plan in 1967. Sharp-witted Scousers immediately christened the new building affectionately Paddy's Wigwam. The Second World War that had interrupted construction of the Catholic cathedral was to prove a major test of Liverpool's endurance as death and destruction came to its streets. Liverpool was the terminus of Britain's lifeline with America, and as such was the most important port in the country. Its strategic value was not lost on the German Luftwaffe, and after a series of minor incidents, the first major blitz came in November 1940. In May 1941, 800 German bombers pounded the city for 8 successive nights, intent on destroying Liverpool.
Do not let us speak of darker days. Let us speak rather of sterner days. These are not dark days. These are great days. The greatest our country has ever lived. And we must all thank God that we have been allowed, each of us according to our station, to play a part.
The dock walls, built 120 years earlier, withstood the pounding, and although 1,400 people had died, the spirit held strong, and Liverpool docks stayed open throughout the war. The remainder of the 1940s and most of the 1950s was spent mopping up the mess left behind by the Luftwaffe. Not until the 60s did rebuilding in earnest begin. Under a scheme put forward by town planner Graham Shankland, a new Liverpool emerged and was marked by the appearance of a new landmark, the 450-foot-high ventilation tower of St John's, 's, 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 Towers of a different kind that would become a feature of 20th century Liverpool also grew up in the 60s. The slum clearance programme, started by Hitler and continued by the corporation, saw the growth of out-of-town estates marked by the tower blocks or Mersey mountains that in later decades have attracted nearly as much criticism as the slums they replaced. Yet more towers grew on Merseyside in the 1960s, this time across the river at Tranmere, where the oil terminus was built, accompanied by the giant Elmsmere Port fuel storage depot. By the early 70s, Mersey was Britain's third largest oil port. Another growth industry of the 60s and 70s came from an entirely different source, in the shape of four likely lads from Liverpool who called themselves the Beatles. Before long, the music and the dialect that grew up in the back streets of Liverpool had a worldwide audience, and the Beatles became as synonymous with 20th century Liverpool as slaving and privateering had been in previous centuries. Sadly, the rise in fortunes of the Beatles coincided with a decline in the fortunes of Liverpool's more traditional trades. Transatlantic passengers were now turning in increasing numbers to the faster option of air flights, leaving Liverpool's luxury ocean-going liners and the thousands who worked on them redundant. In 1970, the Mersey Docks and Harbour Board that had controlled the region's trade since the mid-19th century went bankrupt. Almost at the same time, the camel-led shipyards in Birkenhead that built Polaris submarines and the aircraft carrier Ark Royal lost their government contract. This disastrous sequence of events left a huge hole in Liverpool's economy, and although the construction of a second Mersey tunnel provided some much-needed jobs short-term, it was obvious that the city's immediate future would be tough indeed. Docks that once played host to ships from all corners of the globe now received only occasional visitors. The same was true of grand hotels like the Adelphi that had flourished during Liverpool's heyday as the prestige departure and arrival point for America. Empty hotel room windows looked over once grand and majestic warehouses that were a symbol of 19th century affluence, but now lay empty and derelict, a symbol of 20th century decay. Liverpool, though, wasn't about to lie down and die, and began to face up to the challenge of forging a new future. Gradually, its docks regained some of their lost trade. In the 1980s, the Adelphi was restored to its former glory by the Britannia Group, and down by the river, old decaying docks and warehouses were transformed and given a whole new lease of life. Regeneration of the Albert Dock and other areas may mark the beginning of a significant new stage in Liverpool's evolution. But while the city's metamorphosis continues, there is one thing that's remained constant throughout its history. The river that is the very reason for its existence. Generations of Liverpudlians since time immemorial have grown up with the constant and reassuring presence of the Mersey, Liverpool's lifelong and loyal companion.
This stone on the Mersey in the early morning sun. Dark night has ended, another day begun. There's a time for loving and a time for sorrow too, and a time, my love, for leaving you. Mist over the water as we make our way to sea. I recall those treasured memories, just those of you and me. I recall the fresh sweetness of the seasons when